Baton Rouge, Louisiana. When the quarterback Joe Burrow visited Louisiana State in the spring of 2018 as he considered where to transfer from Ohio State, he came well prepared. His mother, Robin, met with an academic advisor to map out a graduate studies program, while Burrow visited with the Tigers coach Ed Orgeron and 2 offensive assistants. Burrow brought along his father, Jimmy, a 30-year college coach, and an older brother, Dan, who like their father played at Nebraska. Before long, Joe Burrow was in front of a board, mapping out protection schemes. The meeting, scheduled for 30 minutes, lasted 2 hours. The main concern on Burrow's mind, though LSU had the pedigree to command the spotlight and the talent to breed expectations, it had for years been an offensive backwater, a place where championship ambitions often died. What assured Burrow that Orgeron, who cut his chops as a defensive line coach, could evolve from the run-and-play defense formula that Nick Saban and Les Miles used to win national championships more than a decade ago. They convinced us that it was going to be different, and it wasn't just going to be overnight, said Jimmy Burrow, who retired last season as the defensive coordinator at Ohio University. We asked some pretty pointed questions to make sure this was the direction they were going. You just had to trust them. Now, less than 2 years later, LSU is back in the national championship conversation in a convention-shattering way, with Burrow commanding the most prolific offense in the country. It was on display Saturday night in LSU's 42-28 victory over previously unbeaten Florida, as the Tigers eviscerated what had been one of the best defenses in the country, running up 511 yards on a mere 48 plays. The win catapulted LSU, 6-0, to second in the Associated Press top 25, up 3 spots and over undefeated Ohio State and Clemson, and, with 12 first-place votes, nipping at number 1 Alabama. That's what all the guys were talking about. We've finally got an offense, said Kelvin Shepard, a linebacker who had spent the last 8 seasons in the NFL, as he stood on the sidelines Saturday night with several of his former teammates. It's the scheme. Think about if you put Odell and Jarvis in this. That would be Odell Beckham Jr. and Jarvis Landry, 2 of the best receivers in the NFL, who were part of an offense along with other solid pros, receiver Reuben Randall and running back Spencer Ware, that was so predictable it was shut out by Alabama in the national championship game for the 2011 season. This year's offense leads the nation with 52.5 points per game and is second behind Oklahoma with 521 yards per game. The man at the center of the metamorphosis is Joe Brady, a 30-year-old former receiver at William & Mary who was poached from the New Orleans Saints staff to implement a modern run-pass option offense. Brady's hiring as the passing game coordinator is a sign of how willing Orgeron, the 58-year-old, barrel-chested, gravel-voiced Cajun, has been to evolve. Another sign came late Saturday night after Derek Stingley Jr., a freshman cornerback who had been repeatedly picked on by Florida quarterback Kyle Trask, made a diving interception in the end zone at the towering, closed end of Tiger Stadium, which held the roars of 102,321 fans like a box canyon. The turnover gave LSU the ball with 7:26 to play and a 35-28 lead. A commercial timeout provided both teams vowing that Turkey would press on in a speech in Azerbaijan. "We are determined to take our operation to the end," he said. "We will finish what we started. A hoisted flag does not come down." Much of the territory contested in the current fighting was wrested from the jihadists of the Islamic State by an international coalition led by the United States in partnership with a Kurdish-led militia known as the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF. As the jihadists were rolled back, the SDF seized its territory, which it sought to govern under protection from the United States. But that partnership angered Turkey, which considers the Kurdish fighters terrorists for their links to a Kurdish guerrilla organization that has been fighting the Turkish state for decades. It was Mr. Trump's decision to pull American troops out of northern Syria that gave Turkey the opening to strike, setting off the current violence. No longer protected by the United States, the Kurds struck a deal with the Syrian government, an American enemy, to bring its forces north to protect the area. A Kurdish official, Aldar Zelal, said in a statement Monday that the agreement would put Syrian government forces on 2 strips along the border, but not in a section where Kurdish fighters are currently battling the Turks. The government forces would defend the border against the Turks, he said, while the Kurdish-led administration would continue to oversee governance and internal security in the region. But much about the agreement remained unclear, and the Syrian state news media made no mention of it in its coverage of Syrian troops seizing towns and being welcomed by locals chanting in support of Mr. al-Assad. About 1,000 United States troops serve on a number of bases throughout northeastern Syria, but President Trump's orders will remove the troops over the next few weeks, sending them, at least initially, to Iraq. From there, they could be repositioned to other neighboring countries such as Jordan or Lebanon, or head back to the United States, military officials said. For now, the Pentagon plans to leave 150 Special Operations Forces at a base called Al-Tanf, in southern Syria. Trump administration officials had long argued that the troops were needed to check the influence of Iran, Russia, and Mr. al-Assad, prevent the resurgence of the Islamic State, and give the United States leverage in eventual peace talks aimed at ending Syria's war. The administration has not explained how it plans to pursue these goals without troops or local allies in Syria. Mr. Hassan, the Syria analyst, said it had become clear that Turkey and Mr. al-Assad had the most to gain from the American withdrawal and the reshuffling of Syria's northeast. Despite the international condemnation, Turkey had managed to quash the dream of Kurdish-led self-rule that had been growing for years in less than a week. This is the end or the beginning of the end of the Kurdish project in Syria, Mr. Hassan said. Mr. al-Assad and his Russian and Iranian backers had also won big because the United States had expended tremendous resources to defeat the Islamic State, and now Mr. al-Assad is poised to regain the territory. It is not just that you left, but that you did all this fighting on his behalf for the last 5 years, Mr. Hassan said. The biggest losers were the Kurds, who lost their foreign backers and saw their political dreams collapse, and the region's civilians, who were now subject to yet another era of violence and uncertainty. The new fighting in the north has displaced more than 160,000 people, according to the United Nations, limited access for aid organizations, and scattered families looking for safe places to wait out the violence. Syrian refugees living in Turkey said they had lost contact with relatives in the border region as families had fled south into the desert hoping to avoid airstrikes and shelling by camping out in the open far from any cell phone coverage. A Syrian house painter in the Turkish town of Surak near the Syrian border said 3 of his wife's cousins and another couple had disappeared and were thought to have been kidnapped on the road between Manbij and Raksa. No one knows what is happening, said the painter, Ali, who gave only his first name for fear of reprisals against relatives in Syria. The loss of American support has terrified the region's Kurds, many of whom distrust Mr. al-Assad but fear Turkey more. Giving up the dream of self-rule would still be a million times better than having our cities taken over by the terrorist mercenaries and criminal Turks, said Aaron Sheikh Mauz, a Kurdish activist in the border town of Kamishli. But as Mr. al-Assad's forces advanced, others feared the horrors often associated with the Syrian state, conscription into the Syrian military or random arrests that have made untold numbers of people vanish into Syria's prisons. It remains unclear what will become of the more than 10,000 former Islamic State fighters held in Kurdish-run prisons, as well as the tens of thousands of women and children from the Islamic State now detained in squalid camps. Some worried that the new deal between the Kurds and the government could see prisoners handed over to Mr. al-Assad. Hamida Mustafa, a Syrian activist in southern Turkey, said he worried about his brother, who had been detained 2 years ago by the Kurdish-led militia. He had heard on the first night of the Turkish incursion that the common criminals had been released while political prisoners had been moved to another prison in the city of Hasaka. He had not been able to locate his brother, but worried that he would end up being passed to the Syrian government and never seen again. "We are fearful now," he said. "They did that before.